And in the Libyan conflict, Al Jazeera had a very, very important role by claiming that huge number of people were killed the first days, and claiming that it was Muammar Gaddafi's forces or the Libyan government forces that had killed these people. There was a famous video on Al Jazeera showing the demonstration and people running because of the bullets and trying to hide. And Al Jazeera claimed that it was because of this grainy video that the world understood what was happening in Libya. And they argued then that this was the shooting by the Muammar Gaddafi security forces.
Thank you very much for joining us here at the Herland Report, Dr. Ola Tunander. You are a research professor emeritus at the PRIO Institute in Oslo, Norway. And we are discussing the Libya War. And thank you very much for writing the Libya War on how rhetoric and lies destroy the state. And we all know that Libya today is a failed state, ruled by different various Western-supported militia rule and warlords who terrorize the local population. And we know that thousands and thousands, reports from Libya state, around 35,000 people are incarcerated in the most horrible prisons. And these gangs go around killing randomly in order to create and incite fear in people, and nothing is working. And the Libyan state funds from the Libyan investment fund at the time is being looted as we speak. And the West steadily puts out small words coming out of Amnesty International and the UN that they condemn what is happening in Libya, but nothing much else rather than words is coming out of that. And we know that this all stems from what happened in 2011 and the Libya War. And you have spoken in your book about the changing role of the Western media in order to incite such a deception as we saw in the beginning of the Libyan war. But what was the role of Al Jazeera at the time? Because that was initially a good initiative that kind of turned sour, wasn't it?
You could say that, what happened, you could just look at the US understanding of Al Jazeera to see that it was a change. In 2002, I think, US bombed the Al Jazeera office in Kabul. And in 2003, they bombed the Al Jazeera office in Baghdad. And in 2005, there was a serious planning for bombing the Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha, in Qatar. They didn't. But after that, immediately after that, you had ambition to change Al Jazeera and to make it more like a Western style media and more acceptable to the Western, to the British and Americans. And they had Mahmoud Jibril that was going to work with changing Al Jazeera, and he became later so-called prime minister for the National Transitional Council in Libya. I mean, he was a rebel leader in Libya, but before that he started with reforming Al Jazeera. And Hillary Clinton celebrated Al Jazeera, saying that they were able to change the mentality, understanding in the Middle East.
It's strange looking back at that particular time in Al Jazeera history, because I remember Al Jazeera was very critical of the war in Iraq. And they had a number of journalists who were killed also. Working on that, I believe one journalist was also sent to Guantanamo at the time. So there seems to be, after, there was a buy-up, and after the Qatari emir also came into the ownership of them, then Al Jazeera and also the Americans, there was a complete silencing of that initial voice that was critical of those wars.
Yeah, it was a silent coup, or you could say, in Al Jazeera. And that's, and in the Libyan conflict, Al Jazeera had a very, very important role by claiming that, huge number of people were killed the first days, and claiming that it was Muammar Gaddafi's forces or the Libyan government forces that had killed these people. There was a famous video on Al Jazeera showing the demonstration and people running because of the bullets and trying to hide. And Al Jazeera claimed that it was because of this grainy video that the world understood what was happening in Libya. And they argued then that this was the shooting by the Muammar Gaddafi security forces, and the people were fleeing from these bullets and so on. But then someone came up with a longer version showing that this was actually a demonstration in favor of Muammar Gaddafi, and they had green flags and so on. So it was a total lie. But this was used, and it had an enormous importance for how people understood the Libya crisis. And the point is that already you have to do something and come up with the real blunt lies already from the first day, because that will then change the whole discourse.
An interesting element also that we saw in the Libya War, and that we've seen even more, and to the extreme, I would have to say, in the Syria War, was also the use of individuals. I mean, cited in Western media saying, Muhammad Amin stating, I am here at the Green Square in Tripoli, and what I see with my own eyes now is that Gaddafi is killing. And that particular person, I've studied this quite carefully, both pertaining to the Libya and the Syria War. In the Syria War, you have a person called Danny. I don't know if people remember him. You found him all over the CNN. He was given time in the CNN, and BBC almost made a documentary about Danny. And all of a sudden, they vanish again. The same with personas like Jihadi John. We remember him from the ISIS at the time where ISIS existed, which it doesn't anymore. We're now in 2018. Nobody speaks about ISIS anymore, but when they first came. And you also have the same, and they all get killed suddenly, so this way then that person just isn't anymore. And in the Libya War, you also had that numerous people, and they had some mysterious access straight into the Guardian, straight into the Washington Times, straight into, the New York Times, and big portraits and everything. It's peculiar.
They had Al Jazeera and Reuters had interview with one guy in Tripoli who said that the government forces, this was one of the first days, said the government forces are bombing. They are bombing every 20 minutes, and they are just, they are bombing specific areas, and they are bombing everything that is moving, cars and so on. That came out on Al Jazeera, it came out on Reuters, and there were something on BBC, I think, but I'm not perfectly sure on exactly this story was there. And this was a total lie. They checked. There were people visiting the Archbishop in Tripoli and checking the areas afterwards. There had been no bombing. The claim of bombing was a lie, as was confirmed by Robert Gates and Admiral Mullen afterwards.
And also as confirmed by the UK House of Commons report 2016,
exactly.
which they clearly stated that the whole it was really a setup, and most of what we heard in the West really was clearly a lie. So you're wondering, when are we going to see Western leaders go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity? Because we always see Serbians and we see African leaders, black-skinned Africans, are sent to the ICC, but we never see, performs crimes against humanity among, let's say, us white Caucasians. How come we never go to the ICC? So there's an ingrained injustice somewhere here that is very much noticed in Libya and many other places. And the media in the Arab world too is very consolidated and very much Qatari and Saudi owned as well. So who gives the Libyans a voice? That's of course a big question. I would like to quickly add as well to the stories, the invented stories you speak about from the Doha office in Al Jazeera. It's been very interesting to follow also Dr. Saif al-Islam and the son of the late leader Muammar Gaddafi, how he also experienced the same thing when it came to the so-called takeover of Tripoli, because they planned that and coordinated that 2 days before it actually happened, remember?
Yeah.
And the Western media was then sitting in Tripoli, listening to Al Jazeera and making stories. Tripoli is now falling and everything. And Saif al-Islam is taken hostage together with his brother. And then Saif al-Islam actually went down to that hotel and came into that lobby and told them, you guys, stop writing. It's not true. So there was a big deception, and it took many of the journalists at the time over to the Green Square and showed them nothing is going on here. It's perfectly peaceful. And later, the leader of the interim government, Mustafa Abdul Jalil, openly said to France 24, it was the French channel that works a lot in Libya, he openly said on an interview, it's still on YouTube, 2014, stating that, no, we lied. It was a very successful lie, speaking in Arabic, saying that. It was an excellent lie. So in other words, those journalists who experienced that, they know what I'm saying now. Dr. Saif al-Islam knows. Many Libyans know. Jalil also knows.
Yeah, you have different kinds of journalists, so to speak. I think that on the one hand, you have the, kind of sincere journalist that goes down and they know very little about the country. They have read something. They have no particular contacts and so on. They go down to the bar in the hotel and talk with some people that they could talk to, which is American, British journalists and so on. And some of these journalists are not sincere journalists. You had, for example, a CNN journalist called Vedeman, I think it was, who claimed that Gaddafi was bombing Tripoli. And he was in Tripoli when it happened. When he, and there was no bombing. There was no air force bombing of Tripoli or any parts of Tripoli. And he could just check it. So he obviously lied, and he knew he was lying. And so these people, I would guess, have double payment, so to speak. They are paid by CNN and they are paid by some intelligence service at the same time. And these kind of journalists were very common if you look at the 50s and 60s. And perhaps they are common today also, that we don't know. But they are influential, because when the press or the media in the small countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and so on, they rely very much on these journalists, because and they actually believe what they are saying. So and then they have to have people to interview, and some people could come up with someone to interview. And in Benghazi, for example, there were a professional media center from day one, and you don't have a professional media center from day one if you don't have some pre-planning. So that means that there was a planning for the whole operation, and you control the media, and the media people in Benghazi came up with people you could interview. So you could pick selected people that you could trust and let the Western journalists interview them.
You know, in the beginning of the Libyan war, there was instantly or very, very quickly talks about, and I think the UN, the envoy to the UN, Ibrahim Dabashi, was one of those that very quickly in the UN started speaking about there is a genocide in Libya and that there are African mercenaries working there. Now, there were so many guest workers in Libya because Libya was a rich place and a very well, you know, an excellent society, richest state in Africa, and they had a lot to give. Gaddafi gave a lot to also the other states in Africa and helped build up Africa as a whole. So there were very many Libyan, guest workers from other African countries, and we also know that the southern parts of Libya does have a number of black Libyan tribes that are not Arabic of descent, of course, but are more from the south. And almost instantly, as the Western forces or the Western supported forces with the Qataris and all started coming into Libya, you started to see the ethnic cleansing of precisely these tribes in the black-skinned Libyans. And I just wonder why it's peculiar to me that we speak so much about, we're so much against racism in the social democratic societies here in the West and in Europe as well. And yet we so vividly, and our journalists who are supposed to be, I don't know, communists or people really from the radical left, they don't even address these issues of racism against black Libyans when it's happening from the hand of Arabs. Mm. It's unbelievable and unspeakable to this day. The issues of for example, the great Libyan tribe Tawarqa, it's horrifying to see the atrocities done at the moment against these black Libyans in the hands of the Libyan warlords. And we write about it, but nobody of all these social democrats who speak about that we're not supposed to be for racism, none of them want to address it. Mm. I cannot understand it. Do you have an explanation?
Yeah, no, I think it's difficult to understand. It's I mean, if you look at the Tawarqa tribe and the city of Tawarqa, where it was eliminated, 30,000 people, and I mean, many left and went south, and some went to search at the time and so on, and but many were also killed, and many of the black people in Libya came to Libya in the 19th century because of the slave trade. So it was, and what happened when the Misrata Brigade people took over Tawarqa, they used the name slaves on them. They consider them still consider them to be slaves and to be treated as slaves. So and of course, what happened in recent years is that you have had a start of a slave trade in Libya. I mean, what you haven't had for 100 years really, and this was because there is no legal functioning system, so they start to sell slaves on the market, because some people who were migrating from Niger and Chad and so on, coming to Libya, maybe they have stolen their money, or they have no money to pay for their trip, and then they are put in prison, and then they are sold.
When you look at which forces we in the West actually supported in Libya, for example, Abdullah Kim Belhaj, he is now considered one of Africa's richest men, with hotels and resorts and facilities all over Africa and other places in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, very many of those men who so helped the NATO at the time get the power, and were in that group together with the Qataris, and those who were involved at the time are very rich men now. And it's a strange thing, because everyone knew that this gentleman was the head of the Al-Qaeda fraction in Libya. And post-war, he became the military leader of Tripoli in 2011. And the Al-Qaeda flags were seen different places in Tripoli and also in Libya at the time. And then later in 2015, of course, there was also the rumor and coming out that this gentleman now, Belhaj, was the leader of the Daesh in Libya. Now the fractions are varying and all this, I'm fully aware of that, but it's strange that this man was awarded by Senator John McCain as a Libyan war hero, and these are the guys that are doing this to the black tribes of Libya.
No, that's true. I mean, it's and he was the close liaison to Qatar, and then what happened when they took over Tripoli and the Gaddafi headquarters? They were flying the Qatari flag together with the old royal Libyan flag, but and then in certain places they also were flying what used to be called the Al-Qaeda flag, the black and white flag, and his deputy Harati, Belhaj's deputy, he went together with Belhaj. They went to Turkey immediately after the war, and then Harati became leader of the 6,000 man forces in Aleppo, and a lot of fighters from Libya were moved to Syria through Turkey, and also the weapons, a large part of the weapons were moved from the Libyan storages to Aleppo, and this was and possibly also some of the chemical weapons that the Libyan government had. So it's and that was I think a U.S. senator who said that the idea with the Libya War was that you had to have a Libya war before you had the Syria war, because you have to have the weapons and fighters from Libya to go to Syria. And also, as Sidney Blumenthal wrote to Hillary Clinton, you had to have an example of a successful war in Libya to make the Syrian opposition to really start a war in Syria. So that was and the idea was that you would have the same kind of intervention, Western intervention in Syria, as you had in Libya. But it didn't happen, because the Russians and the Chinese put down their foot. So it was a clear strategy that first you had to take Libya, then you had to take Syria, and you have to take Syria before you take Iran, because the problem with Syria was that Iranians could target Israel from Syrian territory. So you had to take out Syria first before you take Iran. This was the idea, and the idea with taking out, Iraq and Sudan and Libya and Iran and also Syria, Lebanon, was that it was not that the US needed more oil really. It was to control the oil market, to have the hand of the oil tap of the Middle East. And that was announced already by the Wolfowitz factions in 1992 in a defense document for Cheney, who was then defense minister. And it was written by Khalilzad, who was later US ambassador to UN. And the idea was that you should control the oil flow to any kind of state that could challenge United States. Europe, Japan, India, China, but primarily China. Because China was perceived already from the 90s to be a dynamic economy, and became even more so after 2000. So the idea of controlling the Middle East was to stop, to have a control of the Chinese economy.
Out of all people, Henry Kissinger has written about this, stating that it would have probably been a better strategy for the Americans to use a portion of realism rather than idealism back in the day of 1993, 92, like you're stating, and that this plan really has grossly failed so terribly. To what degree do you view Russia as a power that works within the framework of a greater sense of realism?
I think, actually, when it comes to the Libya War, both the Chinese and the Russians were, in a sense, naive. Like the Norwegians and the Swedes, you could say. I mean, they actually did not believe that the US and the British and the Americans would go to war immediately against Libya. I mean, there was this preparation for war that were going on from November 2010, you could say. They were planning for a French-British exercise with a war with a dictatorship south of France. There was not so many to choose in between. I mean, and Tunisia was certainly a French ally, a close, very close French ally. So it means that it was actually about Libya. And when you start a war, you preferably do that under cover of an exercise, because you could do all the preparations for the exercise as a preparation for the war. So that means that you could, in a way, plan for all the details for the exercise when you plan for the war in Libya in 2011. And I think that was I mean, of course, this is a kind of idealism, you could say, that Kissinger was the first one who proposed a war or attack on Libya and Muammar Gaddafi already in '69. So I mean, his record maybe is not always favorable to him, so to say, but he is a realist thinker, realist political scientist, and the neoconservatives were very much idealists in their approach to change, to go into one country after the other and change the government. And that's what they continued with. They are still using this idea. And so they try to go from one country to the other and take out the government.
So how would Libya be fixed? What is the solution to the Libyan crisis or civil war, as you see it?
I don't think there is any solution, actually. I mean, I think it's tragic. And you could argue that Saif al-Islam possibly could be enough of a unifying figure to play a role in Libya. But I think also there are certainly strong forces that wouldn't like him to be a new president and so on. So but the Libyan population, I mean, the large majority, I would guess, of the Libyan population is now saying that it was much better before. So even though they didn't like Muammar Gaddafi, but that the situation today is unbearable. And if you look at, for example, Jalil, who became the leader of the National Transition Council, and Belhaj, they are certainly not Western-oriented at all, while Saif al-Islam has, his training in London. So, of course, he's much closer to Europe than the people that the NATO force in 2011 supported. And you could say that in US government there was a split, as I mentioned before, I think, between, on the one hand, Hillary Clinton faction, who was supporting, seemingly at least, the Muslim Brotherhood. They were close to Qatar. They used Qatar as an instrument in Libya, and Qatar get rewarded really very much afterwards with air defense systems, for example. And on the other hand, you have Robert Gates, who said there is no reason to enter the war with Libya. And in Norway, Alfred Berg, who was a chief of intelligence in the late 80s and early 90s, he was also very much critical towards the war, and was, the opposite number of Robert Gates, and had, some close contacts with Robert Gates, and he actually wrote forward to my book in that came out in Norwegian.
No, and thank you very much for writing that book, and thank you for letting us in on your thoughts on the Libya war, how rhetoric and lies destroyed the state. And thank you very much for coming here to the Herland Report, Dr. Ola Tunander. Thank you.
Thank you.